Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank you and the ranking member for holding this really important hearing. I want to thank our witnesses from the Department of Defense and the Inspector General. And I want to thank the witnesses, too, who are here for the second panel representing state government and advocate perspectives, particularly Andrea Amico, who is really a committed voice for her community and New Hampshire, and who will be appearing before this committee for the second time. I do have three questions, I think, for the first panel, and I'm going to start with a question to you, Mr. Kidd. It's vital that communities have confidence that when the Defense Department identifies emerging contaminants, that the department reacts quickly to protect the health of those in exposed communities. One of the concerning findings in the Inspector General report is that the Defense Department's Emerging Contaminants Program put 2 PFAS chemicals on a watch list in 2011, but no additional action was taken at that time. Mr. Kidd, what changes would you make to ensure that this type of needless and harmful delay doesn't occur again?
So, Senator, thank you for your question. So the Emerging Chemicals Program, I have actually one thing that I think the IG should have said in their report is that we need to take actions to strengthen it and make it more robust. So it has a governance body called the Emerging Chemicals of Concern Governance Council. The last time it met was 2016.
Right.
So we are on track to meet in March, and I'm going to make it a priority. I'm going to make it an annual event. So we're not going to wait 5 years between meetings. We're going to make it an annual event. We're going to strengthen the muscle movement in the department in terms of looking at the chemicals, getting the reports, and bringing it to that body for decision. If they do not have an objective, measurable standard to make a decision against, then we will try the best that we can, working through the interagency and our other partners to get that standard that can come back to the department.
Well, okay, so let me follow up a little bit, because the Inspector General's report recommends that the Defense Department revise its instructions and procedures to ensure that officials develop risk management actions and proactively identify and mitigate PFAS chemicals early in the process. That's regardless of whether an emerging chemical is on the Defense Department's underlying emergency chemical watch list or emerging chemical action list. So both to you, Mr. Kidd, and Ms. Macaluso, will you commit to implementing these recommendations as quickly as possible?
Yes, ma'am. We've acknowledged that recommendation, and we've accepted it, and we're working on it.
And Ms. Macaluso?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. And I'll ask a second question, and either one of you can decide to answer it. The Inspector General's office also found that Defense Department officials were focused on aqueous film forming foam, or AFFF, which is a major source of potential PFAS exposure. While that is truly important, the Defense Department did not focus on many other sources of potential PFAS contamination that our service members are exposed to daily. Defense Department procedures require an enterprise-wide approach to emerging chemicals. So will you commit to ensuring that your offices take the required enterprise-wide approach and assess and mitigate the contaminant effects from all sources of potential PFAS exposure?
So yes, ma'am, we've also agreed to that recommendation.
Okay.
The last part of your statement, all sources. So we do rely on industry and other elements of the federal government to assist us in addressing all sources.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Macaluso, you're on the same page here as well, right?
Yes.
Yes, okay. This is a question to you, Ms. Macaluso. There are publicly available Defense Department documents dating back to the 1970s that suggest that the department knew that PFAS chemicals could be harmful to human health. However, the department has used PFAS-containing items for over 50 years, with mitigation efforts only truly beginning within the past decade. Does the department know how many service members were exposed to PFAS between 1970 and 2021? And what has the Defense Department done to proactively notify people who were exposed decades ago?
I'm representing also our colleagues in Health Affairs, which would have a much better answer to that question for tracking that information. I know currently if a firefighter has a question about a future health health effect, that we provide a fact sheet and recommend they talk with their supervisor and supporting occupational medical clinic to address their concern and discuss any additional information or answer questions. And we also are collaborating with VA to address any retired or non-current firefighters in the department.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate that there might be more depth of knowledge from health affairs personnel, and we can certainly follow up with them. But what I'm really trying to get at is, what are you all doing proactively so that, you know, a firefighter from a base 50 years ago doesn't have to read in the newspaper and all of a sudden realize, oh, maybe I should do some outreach. What are you all doing proactively to notify people that they have likely been exposed 50 years ago to PFAS?
That also crosses into working with the Department of Veterans Affairs for that notification, but we are collaborating with them on a plan ahead for that.
Okay, well, I will follow up with you and with Veterans Affairs as well, because I just think it's really important that we're doing proactive outreach here and people understand what the long-term health effects may be and that they're getting the best possible health advice with that in mind. So thank you very much, and thanks to all the witnesses for your testimony. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is, in fact, my pleasure to introduce Andrea Amico from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Mrs. Amico is the co-founder of Testing for Peas, a community action group that aims to educate and advocate for residents impacted by the water contamination at the former Peas Air Force Base in Portsmouth. Mrs. Amico was rightfully concerned when media reports began to surface that an emergent contaminant called PFAS had gotten into the water that her children drank at their daycare center. Fearing for their health and the health of her neighbors, Mrs. Amico began her critical advocacy. From her initial efforts to raise public awareness and get blood tests for those who had been exposed to PFAS at Peas, to the work that she continues today to advocate for the Peas community and communities across the country impacted by PFAS contamination, Andrea has helped bring widespread attention to this important issue, and she has even been honored by the Environmental Protection Agency for her community advocacy work. In New Hampshire, we bring an all-hands-on-deck spirit to solving our problems, and Mrs. Amico brings that to her work every day, rolling up her sleeves and bringing her community together to address PFAS contamination. I am pleased that Mrs. Amico is in front of the committee today, and not for the first time. I joined with many of my colleagues here today when we held the first ever PFAS hearing in the Senate and heard from Mrs. Amico, and I'm glad to welcome her before the committee again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank this entire panel for your work and for your testimony. And Mrs. Amico, I'm going to direct my questions to you. Thank you again for coming to testify before our committee. You've been instrumental in bringing the PFAS contamination at Pease Air National Guard Base in our state of New Hampshire to the forefront of the national conversation, and it's important that Pease was one of the locations reviewed in this Inspector General's report. Over the course of your efforts, you've worked extensively with the Department of Defense. Can you share your recommendations for how the Department of Defense can better communicate and share information with communities impacted by PFAS contamination?
Thank you for the question. I have a few suggestions for the Department of Defense and how they can engage with communities more effectively. The first is I want to first recognize that Mr. Kidd from our first panel has started offering community engagement sessions, and we've had 2 so far. But one of the drawbacks to that format is that it's been Mr. Kidd speaking to the communities quite a bit and not listening, not giving us the opportunity to speak to him. And so I'd really encourage the Department of Defense to host routine listening sessions with DoD leadership officials and with impacted community, PFAS community leaders. I'd also like to recommend that the Department of Defense improve transparency in releasing comprehensive data on PFAS to communities, not just regulated compounds or the EPA health advisories. We know that AFFF is a mixture of PFAS chemicals, so often when they're testing water and soil and other things, they're finding multiple PFAS, but many times they're only sharing the data on just PFOA and PFOS. And for communities to have a real sense of how extensive the contamination is, it's important that we know all of their findings. So that would also be critically important. Impacted communities would like to see improved relationships with local RABs and restoration advisory boards and restoration advisory committees focused on trust and collaboration. Through the National PFAS Coalition, we certainly have heard feedback from many military sites that the RABs and RACs are not a productive or effective way to bring DoD and communities together. They're often hostile and there's a lot of mistrust. I was very happy to hear Mr. Kidd say today they're going to increase training for those RABs. And one suggestion I would have for him is to include some impacted community members as part of that training and to give DoD some guidance on how to best work with communities. I know many PFAS community leaders would be happy to offer that expertise to him. And then lastly, I will say that PFAS community leaders have requested a meeting with Secretary Austin and Deputy Secretary Hicks of DoD, and I think it would be critically important for those officials to meet with PFAS community leaders to hear from people that are most affected by the problem as to what our needs are and what solutions we need from DoD. Thank you.
Well, thank you for those recommendations. I want to follow up now on a topic that Senator Peters and Mr. Spagnola were talking about. As you know, in the absence of comprehensive federal standards for safe levels of PFAS in drinking water, a number of states, including our own of New Hampshire, have acted to set science-based safety thresholds of their own. The Defense Department has provided alternative water sources, such as bottled water or water filtration systems, to some communities and households around contaminated sites, including the communities surrounding Pease. However, the Defense Department appears to only have done so in instances where PFAS contamination is above EPA thresholds, but not for those communities or households that test below EPA thresholds but above state thresholds. So can you tell us how the disparate treatment affects the health of our communities and the relationship between the Defense Department and local communities?
Thank you for the question. Yes, in New Hampshire, we have experienced where DoD, they have taken a lot of responsibility for PFAS contamination and have spent over $65 million to address PFAS, and I am deeply grateful for that. But one issue that continues is there are some private wells surrounding the former base that do have PFAS levels above New Hampshire's MCLs, but below the EPA health advisory, and the DoD will not provide alternative water to those homes, despite advocacy from the local community, our New Hampshire governor, as well as our New Hampshire congressional delegation. And that's a problem because, first and foremost, that does not protect public health. New Hampshire set these MCLs to protect public health. And so for the DoD to be able to pick and choose what rule they follow when it comes to public health is not acceptable. Secondly, it erodes trust with the community. You know, they are at Pease trying to do a lot of work to clean up the contamination, but when they don't fully clean up the contamination or fully address impacted communities, that is eroding trust and it undermines their mission of protecting this country.
Thank you. And I would agree with that, and it's something we have to continue to work on. You've been involved since the beginning in the effort to secure testing for PFAS exposure and contamination around Pease. The fiscal year 2022 National Defense Bill establishes a 2-year deadline for the Defense Department to complete testing for PFAS at military installations and also requires the department to make testing results available to the public. How should the department work with community leaders like you to meet the 2-year deadline?
Thank you for the question. I first want to say I appreciate the deadline that's being put on DoD because I think we heard today they've known about this problem for quite a while and they didn't take the action they needed to do this testing and identify the bases that have significant issues. But I think what we need to see is that DoD deploy a significant amount of resources to test effectively and efficiently. And we also need to see them share the data in a comprehensive way. Again, when they get results, they need to share that quickly with impacted communities, and they need to share all of the PFAS data, not just PFOA and PFOS. And I think lastly, we will likely need to see other deadlines put on them for cleanup as well once those results are back. That's a critically important next step.
Yeah.
Thank you.
deadline's really important. So thank you. It's now my understanding that we don't have any additional senators who are going to ask questions. So I'm going to close out the hearing with great thanks to this group of panelists as well as to our first panel. But I just want to note that to all three of you, the work you're doing on behalf of your state in Ohio's case, and the two of you as citizen advocates in your states of Michigan and New Hampshire makes a really important and true difference, and we're really, really grateful for the work that you do. The hearing record will remain open for 15 days until December 24th at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record, and the hearing is now adjourned.